This section of text is called The Philosophy of Absolute Concentration. In the Appendix 1 is titled The Dialectics of Decline. This is more all over the place. This is kind of a smorgasbord of Horkheimer making critical analysis of a lot of different things. It's really good. It's a really good collection of writings. To start off with a summary of it, practices judge people by their physical or external traits, and in doing so, misread the human character and deform it. These practices, like physiognomy, graphology, etc., measure individuals against the rigid standards of a damaged world, where these practices reduce people to their current limitations rather than looking at their future potentials. So, what denunciatory physiognomy entails is not viewing where man fails as a judgment of the individual, but as a way to condemn the society which causes these flaws in the first place. The human limitation is actually the scar, the frozen moment where social oppression has crushed human growth. This is not a humanistic or anti-humanistic outlook, but the negative image of what liberated man was always meant to be. And so, what you have here is Horkheimer attacking what he sees as the last ideological refuge of the German middle class, that being the dream that history's catastrophes can be overcome by a philosophical synthesis, a reconciliation of all values. This is a full-on assault against the fantasy that contradictory can be overcome through spiritual reconciliation rather than historical transformation. We are anti-everything, and so we are everything. Any concentration which aspires to drive out diabolical eccentricities, left or right, must in the end decide which devil to start with. Every ideology of unity will eventually need to ask what counts as outsider, as deviations, and who gets eliminated for whose sake. Identity thinking necessarily becomes domination. Whenever thought says everything belongs to the whole, something has already been sacrificed. The isolated use of categories like freedom has been impossible since Hegel. Categories do not exist in abstract eternal forms. The theoretical presentation of the existing order as a contradictory, inadequate, and bad reality, one that has yet to snap to its senses, and the practice corresponding to it, this is the sole legitimate recourse to idea. Ideas can become true only as critique, not as ideals or values. Under liberalism, the rights of man are abandoned wherever the rights of private property are at hazard. The spoils that fall to the fascist belong to him by right. He is the legitimate son and heir of liberalism. What this means is that fascism is a contradiction generated by liberal society. The Weimar Order already contained the forces that would become Nazism. The catastrophe was imminent from the beginning. National Socialism can afford to be inept in idealist philosophy because it is adept in capitalist reality. Fascism understands the actual mechanisms of power in a way that liberals do not. The fascist critique of parliamentary ideology in theory and its approach to economic planning via domination in practice demonstrates a better sense of social reality than any modern liberal humanism reformation could dream of. Philosophy must be a critique of political economy. Any philosophy which can call itself political has long since turned into critique of political economy. A metaphysical center cannot explain modern society in the way that this analysis can. Absolute concentration is vain because reality itself is contradictory. No synthesis can overcome this antagonism, nor can any center reconcile history. The truth lies only in negativity, contradiction, and refusal. Every attempt to overcome social contradiction through unity, synthesis, human nature, etc. merely reproduces contradiction at a higher level. Against this, the task of theory is the theoretical presentation of the existing order as a contradictory, inadequate, and bad reality. Anything else would end up justifying it. What is presented as the center in the center concealing is the center concealing antagonism. Okay, the center is always the center concealing the non-center. Synthesis is therefore what has been sacrificed to achieve synthesis. It's never synthesis itself. Anyways, I'll get into the text now. Section 5. The Philosophy of Absolute Concentration. In this section, Horkheimer distinguishes the attitude that critical theory takes towards human beings from Siegfried Mark's neo-humanism by formulating the following task. Philosophical anthropology must become a denunciatory physiognomy. Denunciatory physiognomy denounces the society which seeks the advice of the physiognomist. The portrait of the spiritual or denunciatory physiognomists are only as optimistic as they are unforgiving. Only at the two opposite poles of human contact, where there are no words, or at least no more words, in the glance and in the embrace, is happiness really to be found. For there alone are unconditional freedom, secrecy, and profound ruthlessness. Everything by way of human contact and exchange that lies between is lukewarm and insipid. It is determined, conditioned, and limited by manners of social convention. Here, the word is master, that cool, prosaic device, the first begetter of tame, mediocre morality, so essentially alien to the hot, inarticulate realm of nature that one might say every word exists in and for itself, and is therefore no better than claptrap. I say this, I, who am engaged in the labor of describing my life, and am exerting every conceivable effort to give it to a belletristic form. And yet, verbal communication is not my element. My truest interest does not lie there. It lies rather in the extreme, silent regions of human intercourse. That one, first of all, where strangeness and social rootlessness still maintain a free, primordial condition, and glances meet and marry irresponsibly in dreamlike wantonness. But then, too, the other in which the greatest possible closeness, intimacy, and commingling reestablish completely that wordless primordial condition. Thomas Mann, Confections of Felix Cruel, Confidence Man. In his latest book, Siegfried Mark presents the outlines of an ideology that all the various opposition groups, both in Germany and abroad, should be able to agree with. It is a kind of ideological unification program. Given the abundance of similar attempts in recent literature, the book warrants no criticism for this reason in particular. Regardless, our task cannot be a detailed discussion of this appropriateness of this purpose, which the author expresses unambiguously in every line. The purity of conviction with which Mark has always approached matters of practice, which is on full display in these pages, is justification enough for engaging with his work here. The unforgiving judgment is passed not on the author, but his cause, and in the hopes he might yet, in spite of everything, give it up. The stance of the pacifist that appeared in The Philosopher of 1918 before the piece as a path leading out of darkness has since then too grown dark, now leading out of philosophy itself. Mark professes himself a neo-humanist. It is not entirely clear what he understands the old humanism to have been. Christian humanism, Renaissance philology, Feuerbach's materialism, etc. In any case, he leaves no room for doubt that the new is far superior to the old. A movement which arises like a phoenix from its ashes has lost its naive immediacy. From this time around, the plumage of the myriad bird shimmers with blue, yellow, and red. It is to repeat all the philosophical concepts that were the currency of the immediate post-war period. None of the philosophical or scientific trends that have been fashionable in Germany and successful abroad since the days of Expressionism are not revived somehow. At the very least, by all the alluding language in neo-humanism, therefore almost all political and religious groups who might have cause for dissatisfaction with fascist are supposed to find something in neo-humanism they can recognize themselves in. Individual points of view are reshaped in such a way that the opposing points of view can always be harmonized with them. Their thoughts become indistinguishable from one another. They lose what little remained of their already doubtful substance. Neo-humanism is not in the least bit colorful. It is a monotone gray. Religion fares the worst. The various concepts of God throughout history are said to reflect the wishes of human beings, longings for eternal life, power, justice, etc. The neo-humanist image of God, however, evinces only a longing to be part of a ruling majority. the majority, which unfortunately did not prevail in the Weimar Republic. God is said to be the true center, true totality towards which all opposites, all pieces converge. God is the absolute concentration in light, of which everything, restricted or diabolical, is merely an eccentricity. Anyone who is not immune to this sort of definition of God, by recollection of a better theological tradition, might nevertheless heed the warnings of recent historical experience, namely, that any concentrations which aspire to drive out diabolical eccentricities left or right must in the end decide which devil to start with. Once this decision has been made in Germany in 1919, the course of events taken by the center through 1935 was nothing if not consistent. The consciousness of the so-called center survived as a political ideology long after its already shaken social foundation had utterly collapsed. God, Mark tells us, is a boundary concept, in order to ensure that neo-Kantianism need not walk away empty-handed either. And yet for Cohen, who could hardly be expected to make such a vulgar claim, there is at least no conceivable right and left, above or below, to a divine center, let alone reason for hope in divine mercy. Out of naive immediacy, the notion of diabolical eccentricities is as untenable in religion as in politics. The fact that an incorrect political intention shines through the pseudo-profound religious-sounding formulas of the neo-humanist philosopher is due to the fact that religious impulse has not yet been illuminated by the correct politics. Once truth has been limited out of consideration for both political tactics, it exacts its revenge. Religion becomes the creed of political moderation. Religion, however, is one of the components from which neo-humanism is cobbled together. Liberalism, too, provides inexhaustible motives for humanist concentration, but liberalism has vanished from Europe. The social system of the previous century that went by that name was concerned with the unrestricted domination of the capitalist law of value. Its enlightenment translated into practice via the principle of competition. To the extent that slogans of the Enlightenment hurled against the church and absolutism transcended the immediate needs of interests of the bourgeoisie, and instead gave voice to the rightful claim all human beings have to a free unfolding of their potential for happiness and powers to realize it, they were subsequently hypostaticized into harmlessness. Harmony was consecrated in idea and discarded in practice. In the Middle Ages, a lord was called lord, and a bondsman, bondsman. In the modern era, inequality has disappeared behind the concept of the citizen, or burgher. The transition into this mode of economic production was a historical step that ushered in a time of unprecedented productivity and horror. The historical narrative of this period contains more than just a chapter about the emancipation of the Jews. It also has chapters on the workhouse test, the bloody repressions of the Commune, and the horrors of colonial administration. Maintaining the ideology of liberalism is no more possible than maintaining its economic conditions. This is a really good quote. I'll save that. The objection that classical liberalism is at the very least had the right ideas and come down to applying them correctly today no longer holds any water. This guy was was shitting on quote-unquote classical liberal, whatever that meme was supposed to mean all the way back in the early 1900s. Freedom in abstracto is all too compatible with the allowances of the French police prefectures and the salvation of our Austrian brothers. The isolated use of categories like freedom has been impossible since Hegel. They are true only in the context of the totality of knowing, namely, as critical functions that negate particular truths and conditions, advancing the movement of determinations beyond themselves. Categories cannot prove themselves by reference to how widely they are proclaimed, or how on the basis of how agreeable or disagreeable they appear to be. The theoretical presentation of existing orders as contradictory, inadequate, and bad reality, one has yet to snap to its senses, and the practice corresponding to it, this is the sole legitimate recourse to ideas. In the age of the French Revolution, the ideas in the slogan of the rights of man were out of sync with the end pursued under their banner. In the 19th century, however, discourse about freedom and equality has indeed become neo-humanistic. not because these ideas had already been realized as ends, but because they no longer had any clear connection to current historical activity. The ideas degenerated into ideals. In liberalism, the ideal transfigures the same reality it has been raised so far above, such that the prevailing form of society, which is now driving headlong towards collapse, can appear as just another moment of uninterrupted progress. The ideal exerts a moralizing influence, the commitment to the kind of freedom that is meaningless, precisely because it is never fully realized, sanctions the unfreedom that always is. This was not enough to keep the masses in line, however. One would always think that for concentrations to be meaningful, there would first need to be analysis without illusions according to theoretically valid ends. Bildung's liberalismus, the principle of critique, the religion of freedom, human rights, which floats immovably above, these are the same defensive elements liberalism holds against Marxstaat, elements without which no civilization is possible, and the destruction of which is the beginning of all barbarism. Yet these defensive elements were no obstacle to German liberals defecting to the side of the Marxstaat. This was not simply because they were bad liberals, but because the famous rights of man in liberalism, which, quote, floats immovably above, have their true significance and support, the ground of their existence, in the more firmly anchored right to dispose over the means of production. As a result, the rights of man are abandoned wherever the rights of private property are a hazard. The true liberals of the Weimar era were not the staff of the Frankfurt Zeitung, but the directors of the chemical dye industry, and whatever else might be said of them, they did indeed remain true to their principles. Just how strong said defensive elements liberalism holds against the Marxstaat will prove elsewhere in the world remain to be seen. Not even socialism may fall outside of the concentration. Neo-humanism desires a fair cooperative order for economic life, and above all, a crisis-proof economy. Marx, we are told, is this guy really writing about I miss neo-humanism. Sorry, I thought he said neoliberals, I was like, wait, what? I don't know, maybe, honestly, it might be a genuine connection there, honestly, though. Marx, we are told, did not understand socialism correctly. Certainly, Marxism contains, quote, humanistic motives, but it cannot give any positive definition to socialist humanism. I wish socialist humanists could hear this, because it is a deficient political philosophy. Holy shit, he's going hard. Marx expressly rejects revolutionary opportunism. The autonomous philosophy of history and philosophical anthropology confronts the Christian, as well as the Marxist, with the critical dialectic of the immanent transcendent perspective. How this philosophy is supposed to establish a fair economic order, and above all, a crisis-proof economy, is only ever hinted at. That's how it feels whenever you read anything by cybernetic socialists. Maybe this is what they're about too. You know, because they want to just, like, they're state capitalists. Like, I'm sorry, I read a book by them. I read a whole book by them. Cybernetic socialists, okay, they want to abolish the enterprise form, sure, and then they want to replace it with basically a big regionalized firms, like you kind of saw under Khrushchev, but different because it just is different. And then they want to basically use math to decide everything. So it's like, I mean, I think you could still call it socialism, but it's socialism that's a very technocratic style of it that I don't think is really what Marxism is about, which I think is more about, well, the abolition of the conditions that make political economy possible, not perfecting them. That's capitalism. Anyways, it would seem, however, that Oppenheimer would be a better source for the positive definition of socialism than neo-humanism is than Marx. But perhaps Marx should not be so concerned with having a theory of property and class at all. In this case, socialism would survive in neo-humanism, much as liberalism has a mere Bildungsidee. Having been made presentable, socialism too could move to the same block of the great elector and adopt a similarly vulgar, non-committal use of language. It should be noted that this is similar to Marx's criticism of humanist in his time period, or true socialist. Section 3 of the German ideology, no one has ever read that section, so, you know, but that's his criticism of them. Anyways. Therefore, Marx agrees not with Marxist socialism, but a culturally oriented and anti-materialistic socialism, and he would not mind being called an idealist if the word idealism had not become so abstract and discredited through its use and abuse by beautifully spirited epigons. He avails himself of so many German philosophers of the recent past with such evident respect, however, that it is rather difficult to tell who exactly he is targeting here. For him, all the most beautiful spirits rank as the most realistic and concrete. Marx says that the correct concept is not idealist, but socialist humanism. For, in its very name, it is evident that what it aspires to be, a cultural and liberal socialism. Naturally, it is a cultural socialism that does not oppose the material emancipation of the proletariat, but presupposes it, and even considers it a necessary, even constitutive element of emancipation. This socialism is supposed to be a total movement of struggle for culture, and so does not need to concern itself with the merely material emancipation of the proletariat. The history of German social democracy should suffice as a warning against the love of culture. Instead of adopting a critical orientation towards the dominant culture, the only chance there was of preserving its elements for the future, the cultural policy of German social democracy often amounted to no more than playing dress-up in the threadbare bourgeois costumes of yesterday. Rather like the peasant adopts the old fashions of his lord and master, because the struggle for culture is at the same time necessary to struggle against a specific culture, and indeed only appears as such. It cannot be the total movement Marx wishes it to be. Okay, let me interject here, because that was fire. That was an amazing quote. Horkheimer is falsely labeled a cultural Marxist by people who don't actually read him, because his analysis of culture was never actually about replacing Marx's critique of political economy, but extending it, in a logical way Marx himself wasn't afraid of doing, into the realm of consumption, which under late capitalism, culture becomes a form of commodity production. Human creative practice is inverted and confronts us as an independent economic necessity. This is why the term modernity is thrown around so often, yet never understood by the right. Here he pushes back against idealistic socialism that seems to be full of noble ideas, but in reality leaves the actual mechanics of exploitation untouched, turning critique into a toothless lifestyleism that doesn't touch deeper than aesthetic preference, which is substituted for a determinate negation of the false social reality, which is our actual, goal. When socialist movements separate cultural struggle from material struggle, they do not actually create a new culture. Instead, the threadbare bourgeois costumes of yesterday are adorned, and critique of the material basis of society is turned into a passive imitation of the dominant class of old. Any real struggle for culture is a struggle against the dominant repressive culture, not the creation of an abstract peaceful totality. Culture in the material world is not an isolated independent box, but a historically mediated form of interconnection. This is the problem with culture war people, especially those who define culture war as like gay rights or something. That's a legal and political matter dealing with how class is subsumed, not a culture war affair at all. And to be clear, I'm defining culture war as when you're mad about a movie for 2 weeks and then, you inevitably forget about it because it never actually mattered. We can't treat culture as a clean, autonomous space to build a better world alongside of or above material reality. Emancipation cannot come from an uncontaminated outside, as there is only one world. The task of critical theory is to emphasize that there is no uncontaminated outside to capital social relations. Culture is produced within the same alien social forms as that economy itself. Read the culture industry. The real human content of the class conflict that produces these arrangements is to reveal the human content in the subjective practice within objectified, reified social forms. When culture is isolated from the material conditions or treated as something prior to them, then the illusion is fallen for. Culture is not an independent power or some sort of abstract law of the world at all. Anyways, back to this. So, neo-humanism also maintains close ties to science and literature. Marx belatedly claims that philosophical anthropology, which was at the height of its fashion 15 years ago in Cologne, is now beginning to secure its rights. The idea that Scheller's invention restores freedom to the human essence as its constitutive element is somewhat overstated. If there is to be any restoration of freedom at all, it happens not through empty reassurances of the philosophical anthropologist that it exists somewhere beneath its, quote, mortal form of appearance, or, quote, ephemeral garments, but only through the theoretical and practical critique of the unfreedom which does indeed exist. Mark even offers his support to the Gestalt scientists. He finds neo-humanist approaches everywhere, and therefore proclaims that the present is converging from the most diverse areas towards a concrete image of the human being. Critical psychology of cognition, new monadology, Gestalt thinking, philosophy of the creative center, organic wholeness, concepts all too reminiscent of the true epigons of the beautiful spirit, are each invoked as banners announcing the arrival of the new. Mark imagines that all of these fields are returning human beings to themselves, to the cognition of their own center, to the kind of being with oneself, by beseech, that does not exclude togetherness with being, but guards against surrender to an impersonal one. But philosophy is not capable of this. As long as the world has not been fundamentally transformed, there can be no togetherness with being of any kind, not even the being of the leader that would in the long run protect some of the impersonal beings of the wall that had been lined against. It would be a fatal mistake to assume that the creative center, or one's own center, or whatever dubious names for a supposedly personal centrum one might come up with, could remain free from the clutches of the masters of the mock state, while everyone and everything and everyone on the periphery is rounded up for detention. Techniques have advanced quite a bit since the good old days of the Inquisition. That is precisely what a philosophical anthropology does not apply. The figure who is anointed the great champion of neo-humanism, however, is not Cohen or Scheller, but Thomas Mann. His philosophical and political message is praised with the unreserved admiration. It is itself supposed to be the total sum of everything. In poetic and prophetic form, his message concentrates everything that a philosophical anthropology must express in reflection. We need not inquire into the factual basis on which the coronation of Thomas Mann as Summus Philosophus is supposed to be justified. It is essentially derived from a single sentence in the Magic Mountain. Der Mensch ist Herr der Satz. I don't know German, by the way. Man is Lord of Oppositions. According to Mark, this sentence, which is Nietzschean in inspiration, contains the program of nonconformism, which is by no means devoid of a lover for humanity, but to the contrary, provides the condition for it. It elevates the person in their primordial ground, Ugrund, above every other cause, even the most sublime. Hegel's philosophy, by contrast, is said to, quote, reduce the human being, quote, logically and historically, into a marionette of the world spirit. That's not true at all. The truth of Hegel's logic, to say nothing of the truth of Marxian theory, simply cannot measure up to Thomas Mann's humanistic personalism. Mann stands outside the schema of impersonal dialectics. He guards the legacy of Weimar and gives the image of new human beings a form. Oldest myth and newest presents meet in his work. This is literally how every Marxist humanist talks. They act like they're... When you describe what they believe, they support the, quote, total emancipation of humanity. And when you explain what it is, it's just normal Marxism, you know? So it's like, so what are you doing differently? Oh, they're just putting in the humanist ideology in it, which Marx doesn't need to do. But they have the exact same... They're just repeating him otherwise. Anyways, we may assume, with some degree of certainty, that Thomas Mann would not feel entirely comfortable with the philosophico-political message of neo-humanism he has been saddled with. The author of Felix Krull may find it difficult to recognize himself as the herald of an autonomous philosophy of history and philosophical anthropology in the portrait of a champion of the critical dialectic of the immanent transcendental view. His work contains no program, not even virtually, that is tailored to fit the present, and certainly not one for a nonconformism, which of its reverse side is a condition for the love of humanity. The layer of irony that experienced reader may discern in Thomas Mann's more political writings nevertheless sheds some light on the ground, a rather passive stance of resistance. Even this has more to do with the genuine nonconformist practice than the ideological colors painted over them. The surface on which our neo-humanist fixes his gaze. The fact that today Thomas Mann openly declares his opposition to the enforcers of the totalitarian world order, as his brother, mentioned by Mark only in passing, has for a long time, does indeed have a liberating effect. Because of this profile of his literary work, his testimony carries more weight than it would if it be delivered by someone unknown. However, prophetic ambitions are far from his intentions. Thomas Mann has reason enough to expect that political theory and practice will develop independently from, and if necessary in contradiction, to his own ideas. In that case, however, he would still be better equipped to decide for himself. In his own words, he has the self-criticism which allows our conditioned form of life and spirit to open up to what we no longer are. What comes after us, the future. Given the deluge of request from the devoted readers, he must find it difficult sometimes to tell whether he's supposed to be the champion of a new humanity or an advertisement for the industrious elite. And on the commotion, it is no easy matter for Thomas Mann to carry out his intention, not simply to follow his own agreeable nature, but to make decisions for himself with caution and justice. When it comes to political figures with the ability to lead others out of their corrupted environs, however, having a good name is no recommendation in such circles. The strenuous effort to find great leaders with the most unobjectionable origins possible is not only a revolutionary approach, but is mere opportunism. The reader learns that even Goethe is to be honored in the pantheon of neo-humanism. It is through him that they are recommended to examine the true meaning of the creative, the trans-oppositional, and the human. The proper evaluation of Goethe's message, the appreciation of how central he is to critical significance, is an essential part of the specific neo-humanist field of activity. True, the universities of post-war Germany were awash with the best and brightest minds engaged with this very field of activity, but Mark is evidently not so satisfied. The year of 1932, the 100th anniversary of I said his name wrong earlier, didn't I? Goethe's passage was dominated by the Hindenburg-Hitler dispute, the hunger of the unemployed, and the creeping civil war. The Creative Center lacked any real opportunity to fulfill its vocation with the day ever come when the greatest figure among the Germans becomes a model for actualizations in the realm of the Volk and the state. In fact, Hindenburg and Hitler did not diverge from one another, but converged precisely for the sake of such creative actualizations of the great in the realm of the Volk and state. Hitler corresponds much better to the concept of a greater figure, and still more to the notion of a model for actualizations than Goethe. Mark is an honest opponent of fascism. The fact that Mark's thinking is interspersed by so many cliches of the same spirit neo-humanism seeks to combat should therefore trouble him. Ooh, that's a nice way of putting it. I'm going to use that in the future. Regardless of concern about the dogmatism or any other unpleasantness associated with the use of the old terminology of the unfettering of the productive forces, it is nevertheless both more relevant and less theoretically objectionable a goal than the search for the opportunities to fulfill the vocation of the creative center in a time when the hope for humanity lies less in the abolishing concentrations of political philosophy than it does in abolishing concentration camps. The prospect of ending up in a helpless minority is not as damning of a criterion as it might seem. Even a broad association of well-respected philosophical anthropologists and other independent minds, led by such despisers of the masses as Ortega y Gasset, could be more hermetically sealed off from the theory and practice of history than in the most isolated authors who know only how to find fault with the concentrations of any kind. Mark misjudged National Socialism because he misjudges the Republic in erosion and from. The authoritarian state characterizes the phase of European society that it is now replacing liberalism, whose oppression raises to a higher level. From liberalism, it inherited the task of dominating the masses separated from the means of production and toughening them up into a Volk that could compete on the world market, a task it conducts more systematically through a bureaucracy designed to achieve it. Because these problems could no longer be resolved under the separation of powers by means of parliamentary government, the bourgeois, or at least its most economically powerful core, resorted to fascism for better or for worse. That's a great analysis of fascism. Honestly, I wish they were more clear in their main writings on this. That was amazing. The decision came with the big risk and heavy cost. It has since proven to be the right one. The German army was not an unprofitable investment. The motto of the international competitive struggle, no less than on a domestic front, Den letzten Beben die Hunde, the advantage goes to whoever can volte-face the quickest under the slightest pressure of social relations present. The stragglers must make do with less. The spoils that fall to the fascists belong to him by right. He is the legitimate son and heir of liberalism. The wealthiest asset has nothing to reproach him with. Even the most extreme horrors of today have their origins not in 1933, but 1919. In the shooting of workers and intellectuals by the feudal accomplices of the First Republic, the socialist governments were effectively powerless. Instead of digging down into the very root of these events, they were content to remain on the loose topsoil of facts. In private, they considered the theory an eccentricity. The government made freedom a matter of political philosophy instead of political praxis. Even those who may privately desire to return to this state should at least refrain from wishing this fate on humanity. The ensuing sequence of events will run the exact course as the original. National Socialism is not simply another kind of kitsch literature someone can mock from exile, but it is rather the most streamlined political system of the present. The authoritarian regimes of the world would see right through the neo-humanism of the aspiring statesmen of the League of Nations. National Socialism can afford to dispense with the well-cultured conceptual idiom of an ideology and adjust its so-called Weltanschauung, which I think means worldview, according to its changing needs because it keeps the oppressed masses in line and underfoot with brute violence. The promise of economic opportunity in the future in its own distinctive brand of pleasures. Though in a perverted form, its critique of parliamentary ideology in theory and its approach to economic planning via domination in practice demonstrates a better sense of social reality than neo-humanism could dream of. In Hitler's mouth, the word nation has as much substance as Christianity does sitting in the Archbishop of Canterbury. Any attempt to combat national system by attacking its Nordic physis, resin hell, or power philosophy would also, and in each case, attacking of its very source, a root it shares with liberalism, will always remain a superficial one, no matter how well intended it might be. National Socialism can afford to be inept in idealist philosophy because it is adept in capitalist reality. The ending of the book opens onto a political vision. Mark does not wish to paint a rosy picture of the future, but thinks, despite everything which has been mentioned here, of the possibility of a second German Republic. Like the first, the second is modeled on other existing states. The three great Western democracies, the Czechoslovakian state of Thomas Masaryk and Edward Benz, has exemplified the actualities of this kind of republic, with all the relativities and limitations which are inherent to human beings. Mark interprets these models as liberal populist states. Mark's Second Republic, however, is supposed to adopt three accomplishments of the Third Reich too: the unified state, the office of propaganda, and military sovereignty. The neo-humanist solution is said to be possible only inside of the framework of a solution for the pan-European problem of the same spirit. In a note, Mark expresses a passing worry that the year of 1938 has so far disappointed our hopes. Well, even a correct theory can give rise to false hopes. Disappointment can lead to revisions, perhaps even to overcoming the revised theory. Since the time of the book's publication, the great Western democracies have taught the state of Masaryk and Benz a lesson that neo-humanism could learn something from as well. Against the ZFS, that's their English publication, I think, Mark has made the accusation that, according to its own conception, all philosophical and scientific categories are defined by their interconnection with the human labor process and production process. And yet, if one were to search for any justifications for this requirement in subject matter itself in Horkheimer's work, namely, justification on the basis of immanent laws of philosophizing and analysis of temporal categories, their search would end in vain. Even if this somewhat misconstrues our intentions, we do think that any philosophy which calls itself a political has long since turned their critique of political economy. Either philosophy unmasks the historical situation, or it falls to its aestheticizing epigons. Under the immanence of social relations and monopoly capitalism, the immanent transcendent approach to freedom cannot be maintained. It is still too transcendent. Philosophical anthropology must become denunciatory physiognomy. In 1935, an essay under the title Remarks on Philosophical Anthropology was published in the pages of this journal. A brief comparison to its contents with the doctrine of the Lord of Opposites can shed some light on the basic differences at stake. In a discussion of various anthropological qualities, the ability to make and keep promises comes up in the context of economic excursus. The author says of the foundation of a promise-making and keeping. Quote, it becomes narrower every day, for it is no longer the contract, but rather the power to command and to demand obedience that now increasingly characterizes domestic commerce. The social relationships involved in economic processes affect the entire spiritual and intellectual world, and thus the constitution of human nature. In earlier periods of history, power was considered immoral when it came to conflict with its contracts. Today, a contract violates morality when it runs counter to power relationships. Everyone who has anything to do with such matters knows this, and for that reason, contracts must occasionally be drawn up rather hastily, and they would be settled more quickly now than ever. Their importance remains undisputable. They are binding premissis premetinis. They travel curiously around the atlas of interests in a particular historical moment. We have since had this occasion to make our conception more differentiated and published a further reflection on a related theme before the summit in Godesberg. Negotiation has different faces at different times. Today it consolidates the domination of the biggest capital throughout all of Europe. The national contradictions between the European industrial powers are at present subordinated to the necessity of political reorganization. In both domestic and foreign policy, the world creeps softly or strides boldly towards dictatorship, the most appropriate form of government for monopoly. The skeptical diplomats of the non-authoritarian countries of Europe, who make concessions to barbarism out of love of culture, have behind them dogmatic bankers nervous about their assets. Indeed, even these assets will be difficult to rescue. Machiavelli writes that a general who wishes to keep the field cannot avoid a battle where the enemy is determined upon fighting. He scoffs at the indolent princes or effeminate republics that instruct their generals only to be cautious. This accusation does not touch the skeptical individual in polities that pursue this ineffectual tactic at the end of the bourgeois epoch. They don't even want to triumph. This kind of analysis of temporal categories, which cannot be diluted into an analysis of the existentials of Dasein without general difficulties, happens to forego the task of deriving itself from the so-called immanent laws of philosophizing in the manner of the neo-humanist ontology of the League of Nations. The illusory image of the great Western democracies is not unrelated to the kind of political philosophy that remains unaffected by their fate. The philosophical concept of the human being is better determined negatively by the accurate depictions of the underhanded statesman than positively in admiration of the Lord of Opposites. In a time such as ours, when a polished elite of leaders, economic or otherwise, conspire with and among one another to beat an all-embracing blindness into the masses, an unshakable appreciation for power into intellectual theory coincides with the with the struggle to hold on to something of the senses that humanity must snap of its wishes to avoid having to start all over again from the beginning. The fear of isolation might not without justification decide what actions the political undertaking takes in certain phases of activity does not befit the philosopher. Perhaps Mark will someday realize that the effort to change the world entirely on the basis of a dogmatic premise of philosophizing still contains more truth than the premise of absolute and therefore vain concentration. Excerpt from Horkheimer de Polak, 8/25/37. I don't, of course, have anything new to tell you yet. In Paris, right on the evening of our arrival, we took a tour around the exhibition. Quite grand. But I'm just not a fan of grandeur. It's an industry and not a sympathetic one. Next to the French, it is the dictators who, as is fitting, have the most colossal buildings. Everything is aimed at being colossal. The individual is meant to feel his insignificance in the face of all these colossal things. The profession of architecture and the service of these gentlemen has the same task as that of other branches of culture they dealt with before. It is meant to intimidate and overwhelm the viewer. Particularly disgusting are these women, steadily charging ahead next to the men who are only recognizable as women by their fluttering garments. Charge ahead, what is he talking about? Charge ahead no matter what, ever onward and full steam ahead. This is what's now become of the figure of liberty in Delacroix's paintings of the Revolution, while Fuchsius, in order to praise Dahmer's paintings of the Revolution, incidentally reproaches Delacroix's figure of liberty for being too pretty. I'm happy to embrace this more attractive symbol. We haven't been in any of the buildings yet, only in King George's restaurant, where we ate supper. It was quite good, and the manager is a culinary specialist from Cannes. Of course, if the French are also going to follow developments in the field as in others in the future, you'll be sure to get grasses, raw beets, celery juice, and the likes, freshly washed and presently surrounded by ice cubes at the beginning of a meal in a restaurant like this. And hygiene, which is the only thing the aforementioned colossal allegorical figures seem to represent, will also triumph in the kitchen. Of course, we could have studied in depth the pre-established harmony between the conduct of war, bad food, and the physicians who declare it healthful. Basically, however, I'm not very tempted to walk around these contemporary exhibit halls. For the sake of research, I'll go a few times anyway. For me, exiting them will always be preferable to entering. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Mary Jehoda, 810-38. Among the many letters I receive from you nowadays, there are hardly any whose train of thought appeals to me more than the which your letter bears witness. One sentence you wrote regarding the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia touched me most of all. One would have to feel intellectual satisfaction that clarity and logic have emerged, obviously victorious. I have stated it more positively. The theory that's been so unambiguously confirmed in the past few years, and now in the most apparent crisis where it is against us, this theory is a complete whole. It will also be affirmed where it is for us. How right you are in making fun of the slogan that the English will go to war for the freedom of Czechoslovakia. The English of all people. It would have hit the mark almost precisely as the 1914 slogan of the Western powers for democracy, in quotes, and Prussian warmongering against Tsarism. I'm not even entirely in agreement with you with your proposed slogan against Hitler. For our position, in my view, Hitler is so obviously determined by the current historical development state of social conditions that, if these conditions remained the same, he would have to be constantly reproduced, even if in the help of the countries that could in fact overthrow him. Against Hitler, therefore, refers purely to the appearance and not the essence. If, however, because of diplomatic reasons the essence can't be named, there is no hope that the battle will achieve its goal. Humanity has been beaten back to the extent that would be very little hope from a war. Theoretical work is currently more important than ever. Oh my god, he is spitting fire right now. A lot could be said about your ideas on dictatorship. It seems to me that your use of this concept is a bit cliched. On the one hand, planned economy is such a barbaric phrase that it justifiably raises suspicion against the thing itself. That the socialists have replaced the concept of a free association of human beings with the concept of a planned economy illuminates the path traveled by them for many decades. He is spitting fire in this letter. In my mind's eye, I cannot foresee the executives and the professors who would be the planners under such conditions. I would certainly belong among those who to be managed. To the extent that the concept of a planned economy is not the wall behind the certain democratic authorities and part of a union bureaucracy worm their way into fascism. It is a utopia of professors of political economy who already see themselves in it as advisors to the relevant bigwigs. Excerpt from Horkheimer to André Sternheim, 10738. The overall political situation is incredibly sad. Through all the cries for war, Kriegssegdrexes, I never had a moment's doubt that the so-called honorable peace would be maintained. That the Volker were in such a state of agitation has had in this case a desirable side effect. The participating statesmen everywhere appear as heroes of the peace. You are entirely right to say that the grounds for prestige, which would motivate going to war, have a very strong effect in Germany. But these grounds for prestige were not, as you might think, themselves grounds for the German government to go to war, which it would only have initiated against Czechoslovakia or Russia with the express consent of England and France. Instead, such a circumstance was only grounds for Chamberlain to save Hitler from embarrassment. In an appraisal for the political situation since 1933, it must be assumed that the present-day German government, once come to power, has been exercising an essential function not only for Germany, but for Europe, and from which even the powers of the West cannot exempt themselves in the long run. The fall of the German government could, in any case, only have consequences the likes of which neither the English nor the French governments would want. In the event of war, the French and English governments would not have known which outcome would have presented them with more frightful problems, victory or defeat. I'm convinced that, as far as the Central and Western Europe are concerned, we may expect a fairly long period of peace, albeit an incredibly sad one. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Hans Claus Brill, 1013-38. At the peace, which has become appetizing to the people through the gigantic effort made to show it was under threat, the great statesmen and their preferred publics took care of the rest by weeping for it in person. Chamberlain wept, Simon was deeply moved, Daladier wept, the Czech ambassadors wept, the Pope fainted from being so moved, women presented flowers, weeping. The terrible revenge for the victors in the Sudeland all began with the tears of those who handed it over to them. These tears are an aesthetic phenomena of the first rank, and of the artistic motives I would like to collect documentation on them. It would be grateful if you could cut out many in-depth reports from the pages of German and French newspapers about these emotional scenes and send them my way. What is he cooking? Why is he want reports on people crying? What is he doing with this? Anyways. Excerpt from Horkheimer to H. Honegger, 9538. What do you say to the Italian anti-Jewish laws? The point of least resistance. Since the world can't be gobbled up as quickly as thought, they're going after the Jews. At the same time, the fascist successes in the last few years are really no trifling matter. Danzig in Austria and Abyssinia and I don't know what else. The sphere of influence is expanding to all parts of the world, and in spite of that, you hear "whip the Jews." Things are not going well to the masses under fascism, however much it's growing. It's not leading people to the right frame of mind, but purely to the illusion of being in the right frame of mind. And that's just not the same thing, even if today, not even philosophers know anymore how to make the distinction. To make people really happy, continuous improvement of living conditions is required. Unceasing change of the world. Simple practical steps suffice to guide them to the illusion of happiness. For example, the segregation of minorities, who are always worse off than the masses. Excerpt from Horkheimer to K. and E. Goldstein, 11-1938. During this decline of the world, the desire is overwhelmingly to set down what one has to say so that it cannot fall into the right hands at some other place and time. Not only love is contained in this desire, in the midst of all difficulties, I've made a remarkable discovery: books are being burned in Europe. Some hope rest in the libraries here, but more and more, the books that one gets one's hands on show signs of a strange illness. It begins with the four edges of the pages taking a red-brown color that then makes its way further and further towards the center. The part it questions first becomes brittle, and finally, all life seems to have fled from them. If you touch them, perhaps folding down a corner, or perhaps part in question stays in your hands and turns to dust, it is mostly the French books that show such signs of weakness, but in no way limited to them. Nature is in cahoots with fascism. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Adolf Low, 11-25-38. I am presently under a frightening amount of pressure from work. Otherwise, I would write to you at length. For today, only this. I have decided to begin the preparatory work for the book on dialectical philosophy. In the spirit, I plan to discuss matters with you not infrequently, and hopefully not just in spirit, but face to face. The general situation is developing in a completely logical manner. Knowledge that the theory is exact in its negative aspects does not, to be sure, alleviate the horror, but it does justify the hope that it will one day prove itself in its positive aspect as well. War over the Czech question was impossible. Moreover, it was not even desirable. The battle cry for democracy, which would otherwise have drawn a number of countries over to the field against Germany, was in any case not an opportune one in light of Germany's demand for the right to self-determination, for the Sudetenland, I think that means Sudeland, the resulting ideological confusion which would have exceeded that of the World War. Beyond this, there was no group in Germany which would have been capable of leading it rationally in the case of defeat. Nothing has changed. In Deutschland, nicht News, the report would have to write, if only 50 Jews were slaughtered a day. I'm a little. I don't really understand I'm not like, I don't know a lot about history. I'm not really like a history person, so I don't actually know the context of what he's saying here, besides just vagaries. Anyways, exit from Horkheimer to Julie Favez, 12/6/38. The news from Germany, and not only from Germany, is so shocking that nothing can be said. The only consolation that can only still be offered to humanity is that in this terrible time of confusion, which may well last for some decades yet, will, like the decline of antiquity, sow the needs of a new and purer culture. A process is also taking place now that can be compared to the development of Christianity. Lies and horror have spread so thickly over the world that those who do not allow themselves to be consumed by them will, to a great extent, become immunized against moral evil. There are a few seeds, and more go under every day. But in the end, this experience cannot pass over humanity without leaving a trace. The concepts of the infinite value of the individual soul, of mercy and brotherly community, arose from the ancient tyranny and slavery. Totalitarian mass mania will also give way to a more concrete conception of freedom than was previously held in general. One could of course reply that the people who perish today, and probably the people living today overall, will have no more of this, but the semblance of such hope, which may visit the despairing in their final minutes, derives its historical right from this idea. That the night does not last forever may yet console those killed in it. Despite everything, what the human being is will not be decided by the anti-humans who today are making the earth into hell. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Heinz Jacobi, 2/16/39. Dear Herr Jacobi, I thank you for sending your work, a short essay titled Die Verunkrug des Menschen. Of many manuscripts which were received at present from Europe and other parts of the world, yours is one of the very few we have found close and sympathetic to us. Proof such as this of your mentality and the direction of your interest is another example of just one of the reasons we sincerely regret not having a presence over there. It seems to me, in any case, that we could be of greater help to more people in most decisive matters there, more so than we can here. What you say on page 2 about the division of labor could be developed into a highly important analysis of the fundamental processes with which lead to reversal into the totalitarian state. In addition to your considerations on bureaucracy, I believe that your method, Verfahren, will advance even further with time as you continue to sharpen your suspicion of immediate positive categories. Concepts such as humanitarian and morality of solidarity are to be used only with the most extreme caution. Such words risk being all too acceptable to all too many people. The distinction between your critique of fascism and the critique of those who merely displaced or replaced by it must jump out to the reader from the start. Thus, when you quote the sentence that man loses that which is essential to him under the domination of the apparatus, it will be rather difficult to outline this essential with the greater precision because it relates not so much to the past as it does to the future. What is certain, however, is that the specific region of philosophy it calls to mind, and from which you have adopted, tends to burden your argumentation with borrowed obscurity rather than making it more transparent. Belief in something ordinary, inward, and essential, or in some other primordial reservoir which has somehow been lost to us and we are supposed to remember once more, would in fact be quite difficult to justify. With good reason, you inveigh against spinelessness before the fetish of the apparatus. You demand, however, the retention of moments which relate to character. Certainly, there is much to recommend this, but I believe I need not point out that the struggle against the apparatus and for character originally belongs to authoritarian ideology. It is infinitely difficult to use such concepts with the correct mediations. Indeed, I would say with the right touch of irony, by means of which the relationship to the whole of critique, which, as we know, is alone the true ones, is preserved. Here, problems of this style come into play. problems which make it so difficult for me to write at present should I hardly arrive at any final formulation. My short remarks should show you how seriously I have taken your small work. Excerpt from Horkheimer to J. Favez, 9/11/39. Your letter of August 21st, 24th, and 29th lie here before me, and much has happened since you sent them. A state of war has been declared, which is nevertheless not yet a war, and a war is being waged, without such a state having been declared for it at all. You are right to say that the knowing in the present has the immediate effect of a kind of consolation. This is the only reaction of human beings who refuse to be driven mad by reality. I confess that today, the most dogged unswervingness is needed not to lose sight of those tendencies of social life which we once recognized as those which are now more fundamental through the chaos of facts. If the improbable, a general condition of war should take full effect, then the shared interest between Central and Western European powers, which has determined their politics through the summer of this year, would indeed seem to have been extinguished by contradictions which we do not consider relevant at the time. However, it is precisely this which I cannot bring myself to believe. Rather, even in this extreme case, the development towards barbaric collectivism, which Europe would not have had to confront regardless, could not have been terminated. I do not know whether it would even have been slowed. The feeling that the ideological opposition in whose name war would be waged is already outmoded, and that if no miracle occurs, the Volker concern would all fall prey to one and the same fate, is horrifying. The wariness, however, over the prospect of war, which is apparently among the whole Western populace, has, I believe, its foundation on the insight that even victory would not solve the most crucial problems. The abatement of enthusiasm in France is no coincidence. It signifies something quite different from the absence of enthusiasm in Germany. Here, there is an extremely alert skepticism towards the government, which could, under certain circumstances, reverse into outright antagonism. There is a feeling of senselessness, which form one of the preconditions for as of yet unsatisfied authoritarian longing. Unfortunately, I cannot now speak in more detail. It would be seen out of place. For now, I am only full of the wish that this, I am firmly convinced, senseless and calamitous process will go no further. However, I want to take this opportunity to say one thing for you at the time. Whatever may come, you may be assured we are thinking of you here and will not let you down. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Paul Honigsheim. Heartfelt thanks for Voltaire and the problems of reapproachment between peoples. In the present moment, this reapproachment seems to be carried out under a rather unpleasant way, as between Siegfried and the Marginot Line. To your mind, what would Voltaire have said about this? Would he have been, in this case, pour ou contre la guerre? It would seem to me that the concept of war and peace have been, in a dialectical manner, set into motion by history, such that the condition of war on the Rhine is decidedly preferable to the condition of peace we find in other countries. And in even, I can imagine a number of Jews and other people of color who would rather be in no man's land than Vaterland, even if the French General Staff were to issue a daily communique about it. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Paul Ludwig Landsberg, 1223-39. At the moment, I am interested above all in the problems of pure logic. As you well know, I have long been preoccupied with the Hegelian logic, but have published hardly anything on the topic. Well, can you please do it? Meanwhile, I am also increasingly convinced that the struggle against the prejudices of formal logic themselves, a symptom of decadent philosophy, is unavoidable. Even if Hegel's attempt to free philosophy from the dictates of formal logic went hand in hand with an extremely dubious metaphysics, he nevertheless deserves recognition for having grappled with the most important task of that intellectual historical epoch. You must be rather optimistic to believe you see a light at the end of the tunnel, no matter how hard I must strain these eyes of mine. However, I cannot spot the slightest glimmer on the other end. To me, the future appears to be but pitch black. I grant you only this, that it is a tunnel, and so humanity can find its way out. What's left to us is hope, good wishes, and you I send my most heartfelt for the new year. I know that you two cannot truly be happy so long as the fate of humanity takes no clear turn for the better, and in this spirit I wish you both happiness and, if I may add a very personal wish to this, hope the four of us will see each other again alive and kicking in our beloved Paris. But not even this wish is purely personal. For it to be fulfilled, France would need at least lasting peace, the ocean navigable once more, and the monster defeated. That love plays no role indeed only suggests a rather poor prognosis for everything we call culture. As I once formulated the matter on an earlier occasion, culture rests on foreplay. Of course, this is only true of the culture we already know. Perhaps something will develop today which is, despite everything, worthwhile. Horkheimer to Henry Grossman, 8-9-39. Appendix 2. Excerpts from Horkheimer and Adorno's Critique of Religious Socialism, 1931. Translator's note. From a conversation hosted by Paul Tillich in 1931, discussions about the task of Protestantism and secular civilization, opposite Tillich's roster of religious socialists and systematic theologians, Horkheimer and Adorno were recruited to represent the non-theological position, materialism, socialism, philosophy. They do not disappoint below. I've translated the opening remarks made by both Horkheimer and Adorno, in which each takes a different approach to immanent critique. Horkheimer dissolves the religious socialist problematic by simultaneously grounding and relativizing their absolute opposition between the religious and the secular, positing the problem of theory formation from within the field of social struggle in response to shared suffering as a criterion for the evaluation in the theories which claim to address themselves to it. Oh, that's very interesting. Adorno explodes the religious socialist solution from within through bringing the moment of its concept to completion, at which point the task of Protestantism and secular civilization, namely demythologization, is shown to have fully migrated into the realm of the profane, by determinate negation, along with the religious Urmotivin, which, if we must speak of them at all, are no longer inherited through established religion. Both defend materialism as a philosophical attitude, socialism as a political program, and to deny the significance of the antithesis between the religious and the secular assumed by the religious socialists and systematic theologians. Each exemplifies the respective model of dialectical critique, which they will develop throughout the 1930s. For Horkheimer, the open-ended dialectic which follows Hegel's "the truth is in the social whole," but recognize the whole is the false. For Adorno, the determinate negation, in which Die Sachselbst of idealist thought, betrays the untruth of idealism in the social content of its complete concept. As the discussion continues, both Horkheimer and Adorno's objections grow sharper. It is a remarkable prefiguration of their future dynamic. Horkheimer. I would just like to express, in brief, the impression Frick and Tillich's work have left me with, and how I responded to them. I only ask that you now accept the barbaric nature of my explanation in advance, for my response is somewhat barbaric indeed. Hell yeah, barbarism. We're choosing barbarism. My thesis, quite brutish, somewhat exaggerated, are as follows. First, I do not believe, cum grano salis, that what lies before us is truly a field of rubble. What are we really talking about here? If you will permit me to speak in my own categories, I would say capitalism is not merely a field of rubble, but, on the contrary, has a preparation, the organization of a world, is not its entry into a new phase through methods which are not yet in fact radically new. True, certain constraints will most likely remain. Next, I would ask, what really is this modern hardship under which we are all supposed to suffer? For my own part, I would rather not assume this without further reflection. Do we really all suffer from one and the same hardship today? Is it really the hardship of the problematic of profane culture which torments human beings so? Human beings are tormented by much more real, much more brutal things. It seems, and this torment is not a new one at all. This suffering, this materialistic suffering of human beings, is what torments me as I stand here today, and on this matter, it is in fact important for me to take a stand. From this point of view, I can do nothing but side with a certain parity in the struggle. And I believe the most important thing of all is to wage this struggle in such a way that the senseless torment, so far as it is senseless, is put an end to, so far as it may be abolished at all. When I say senseless, I mean something quite different from most of those present today. By senseless, I understand any torment which is to any degree unnecessary in light of the spiritual, intellectual, and material forces which are at the disposal of human beings. I have the impression, in theory of the world I cannot simply rid myself of, that the dominant organizational form today, in essence, conditions and causes this real suffering and torment. When I was at university, I was often told, why yes, human beings must always suffer in the end for the nature of scarcity. To speak as politely about it as I was able to then, this turn of mine has long since been proven false. Things are in no way just so, and anyone with the least formal education can tell you that what it comes down to is the organizational form of humanity. To what extent this might be connected with spiritual affairs is a significant problem. It would only say if I position myself within this struggle, and this is what most important to me. Is it really all that important whether the way the struggle is conducted is aligned with primordial religious motives? I would almost say, to follow a suggestion of Spinoza, that I have too little time to pose this question or problem to myself. Is there some philosophical or religious view that certifies my attitude of this struggle is the right one? One might say, as I have recently formulated it, that ordinarily, the metaphysics, the religious, are not much impressed by what torments human beings. Metaphysics is too little moved by their suffering today, has too little love for the transient human being. I thank Herr Frick for his clear presentation of these problems, but I do not know whether any of this is at all important. Whether secularized civilization should be characterized as technological, that this also characterizes the Weltanschauung that undergirds it, how the human being with such a view beholds himself, all of these things, even if they really oppose to religion, are any of these problems truly decisive? I am of the conviction that the so-called deification of the machine is a more transitory phenomenon. In Russia, it certainly has a different significance than in America. At least to speak as an economist, I would say that your conflation of America and Russia on this point makes for a superficial diagnosis. A whole series of issues, such as those I have mentioned, seem to arise primarily from the fact that theologians, and too many others among us for that matter, concern themselves too little with the realities and can only see a great opposition between religion and on the one side and the secular on the other. I know not which of them could at least have the last word for our time. Adorno. Horkheimer has anticipated much of what I wanted to say. I will attempt to formulate something on the theme of the profane. What lies before us seems to be the following. To use Tillich's own terminology, he characterized the relation the profane to Protestantism as a dialectical one, i.e., so that on the one hand, the theological must fully migrate into the profane without reservation in order to prove itself genuine. On the other, a claim is made on the profane that because it has only an anarchic, chaotic character, because it is a field of rubble, it has need of the religious. I believe that so long as one stands by this conception, one has not taken the claim of the profane itself as radically or as seriously as it would be necessary for anyone who truly grasped the thought of the profane as the theater of truth. The religious motive, which in Tillich's conception, at any rate, would be the deepest lying and most profound one, is that of de-demonization, which I call demythologization. This is, however, a motive, and this seems to be crucial, which does not itself need to be derived from any of the given motives in any positive presently existing theology, but which has rather migrated into the realm of the profane. I could even imagine that in this crucial moment that the function of Protestantism has in fact in historical terms been simultaneously fulfilled and exhausted, that the migration of its significance into profane categories has been entirely successful, and that this claim of demythologization has migrated completely into the profane as well. If this is the case, it might be that the theological categories themselves, so far as any still remain, are no more than empty husk from past stages of history in the process of demythologization, in which are dredged up for purposes I neither would nor could always characterize as good without reservation. I know very well that the relationship is not so simple in Tillich's theory, that the process of demythologization is not a clean but a dialectical one, that the mythical cannot simply be expunged but always reappears time and time again, and that the true productive forces of history are precisely those reservoirs one might characterize as mythical. This, I would think, would have to concede. Nevertheless, I would argue that this moment of return itself, of carrying the mythical along with us, is by no means localized within the sphere of religion proper, but that the return of the mythical also finds its place in the sphere of the profane. It seems that in the prehistoric phenomena of hunger, there resides precisely that demonic power which must be stopped time and time again in order for the grip of the demonic to be truly broken. Thus, I prefer to speak of demythologization rather than de-demonization. Demythologization is dialectical. On the one hand, there is a part of nature to which humanity might in the long run reconcile itself. To me, it seems the possibility of reconciliation lies in the sphere of the profane, and furthermore, that the moment of necessary mythication falls away because it lies in the sphere of the profane as well. However, I believe that if one accepts a concept of Protestantism, such as that represented by Tillich and Frick, one ought to demand a radical break from the positive forms of the Church in general. Now, for the detail, the primordial religious motives. Here, there is some rather dubious equivocation at work. If what is to be understood is nothing other than there is something religious or mythical which lies hidden in socialism, which resurfaces, recurring again and again, then I would say these primordial religious motives are nothing other than questionable demonizations which must be fought against. For example, Fyodor Stepan, Lenin cult. These motives, the so-called primordial religious motives, must be banished. The instant one wishes to reduce socialism to such moments, they have tied themselves to precisely that which must be criticized by socialism in the most radical terms. This applies equally to fetishization, the cult in the machine, which is incompatible with the most basic notion of socialism, with the very ontological development of socialism. If we must speak of such primordial religious motives, they are not to be found where religious goods have been littered throughout the sphere of the profane, but are only truly found there in the most profane of the profane, and in the attempt to remove them from that place where they are found, as if they were still unproblematically religious ideas, seems the wrong path. As things stand, an expression such as that of the religious man, who may be active in socialism or elsewhere, strikes me as one deserving of the highest suspicion. In truth, the religious man is probably the unreligious one, if by religion one is still to understand demythologization. Postscript. Adorno avec Wahl. Dating back to the French reception of Max Scheler, an existential philosophical school has formed in France, grouped around the Recherches philosophiques, and propagating the doxa of Heidegger and Jaspers. The aim of Jean Wahl's compendium is to support such efforts through documentation tracing the origin in existential philosophy back to Kierkegaard, which is already plain as day in the academic Signs und Daseins philosophy in Germany. Since Bach's study of his work in 1903, Kierkegaard has by no means been entirely unknown in France. Wahl's book, however, is the first undertaking in French reception to present Kierkegaard biographically and theoretically as a monumental figure. The etudes show the utmost expertise, erudition, and care. They endeavor from the outside to find continuous, sprunglos, unanimous motivations throughout Kierkegaard's body of work, but to adopt one of Wahl's own distinctions, the etudes, for all intents and purposes, count as interpretations rather than explications. In each case, they proceed in all energetical fashion, and mostly in an apologetic one, that there is no room left for critique, be it of Kierkegaard or his fashionable epigons. The question, which finally appears in the shortest chapter titled Conclusions Questions, are posed in a rather tranquil form. Was Kierkegaard bound to sacred scripture in an authoritarian manner, or was the Kierkegaardian concept of paradox merely a rationalization of private experiences? These questions are never driven to the point of philosophical analysis of Kierkegaard's concept of subjectivity itself, nor to any of the analysis of the fictions which lurk behind the doctrine of the individual as a relation relating to itself absolutely. But Kierkegaard, in particular, should be defended against such exegetical respect. Wahl makes Kierkegaard out to be a classic, removing the sting of the thorn, which is not only felt in his own flesh, but turned against society. Kierkegaard avec Nietzsche, master of the dialectique existentielle. the trivialization of one who in the end published by the Augenblick and declared therein that in Christendom the proposition the moon is made of green cheese could easily be enforced as a state religion as soon as the preacher were paid for it. The trivialization of a thinker who was, despite everything, a true enemy of that which exists. This trivialization is particularly manifest by the fact that Heidegger and Jaspers, who first warped Kierkegaard in their distinctive grandiose style into a conformist and ideologue, are discussed alongside Kierkegaard inter pares as if peers, receive long separate sections of their own, in which their relations to Kierkegaard are treated at length with great delicacy. What is demanded of any faithful reader than merely respectful exegesis never occurs. Protests against abuse and of the Kierkegaardian victim of an happy consciousness further festive cult of darkness. Only once during the insight dawn. That's French. In other words, one may wonder whether such effort does not, in fact, seek with great ambition to strike him dumb. Where Kierkegaard finds himself is concerned, in any event, in the unscientific postscript, the very concept of ontology is expressly dismissed. Thus, alongside his unbroken solidarity with Kierkegaard, who wanted nothing to do with such affairs, a solidarity for business as usual prevails in Wall, who would serve as an intermediary between the concerned parties, even as far as the robust house philosopher of Eugene's Derrida Vlog. In the scientific sphere, however, Wall's book achieves everything it set out to do. Like Wall's, Lowry's book seeks to attract a readership for Kierkegaard by extensive documentation. It assumes readers will be unfamiliar with the text, but the endeavor to abstract English and American interest is quite different from the effort to draw in the French. Where Wall's concern is motivation, Lowry is content with the biographical. Kierkegaard's thesis that subjectivity is truth becomes cheap pretext for self-effacement, and because his work is so largely autobiographical, or reflects his own life in such successive stages, no interpretation of them can be intelligible which is not essentially biographical. Lowry's biography is orthodox in more than one sense. One could almost say it adheres strictly to the framework of the Bayreuthian Kierkegaardian tradition as represented today by names such as Edward Geismar and Immanuel Hirsch. The unrelenting impulse towards justification for the hero prohibits his caustic procedure any critical insight into the self-stylization of Kierkegaard's life. The relationship to Regain, Jean, the affair he provokes with the Corsair, the final sickness, all of this appears at the whim of Kierkegaard's magic formula, and the whole effort of the biographer is restricted to smoothing over any possible contradictions. The sole pragmatic boon of the study may be seen from the fact that Lowry throws the political conservatism behind Kierkegaard into clearer relief than the psychologically oriented authors are capable of doing. Biographical zeal blinds Lowry to Kierkegaard's philosophical content and thus necessarily turns him against subjectivity itself, which is, after all, supposed to be the truth. To illustrate this with a single case, Lowry provides a glossary of Kierkegaardian terminology in the appendix, which is, on the whole, questionable at best. Under the heading of dialectics, one finds the whole wisdom, since S.K. criticizes sharply by Hegel's dialectical method, it must not be supposed that the dialectic he so much insists upon is the same thing. Both deal with opposites, but the difference is that whereas Hegel mediates between them and thus reaches a point of repose, S.K.'s thought continually vibrates between opposite poles, recognizing that the contradiction and paradox are inherent in existence, which, because it resists the effort of reason to regiment it into a system it denounces by reason as the absurd, one need only contrast Lowry's caricature of mediation as a point of repose with the famous definition from Hegel's Phenomenological, according to which mediation is nothing but self-moving self-equality, or it is a reflective turn into itself the moment of the I existing for itself, pure negativity, or simply coming to be. To realize just what kind of blessing is bestowed upon Kierkegaard in such restriction to his own existence, that Kierkegaard is determined by Hegel right down to the innermost cells of his contradiction. Indeed, that he has Hegel to thank for his most important counter-concept, the qualitative leap, remains unknown to Lowry. Thus, he is completely incapable of understanding Kierkegaard's concept of dialectics itself. He even arrives at the grotesque assertion that, in the final phase of Kierkegaard's life, which Lowry unquestionably regards as Christian in the positive sense, Kierkegaard apparently having himself at the point of repose was no longer dialectical, as if dialectical theology did not exist. The complete lack of both erudition and penetrating insight into his thought makes Lowry's tirade against his professor in research, which Lowry recites in imitation of Kierkegaard, doubly embarrassing. However, the function such tirades assume for Lowry is betrayed by the sentence, Eric Priswara, one of the most talented of the younger Jesuit theologians, has written a prodigiously clever book about SK, so clever that I do not pretend to understand it. Kierkegaard certainly hated his Hegel, but at least he did not boast about not understanding him. Today, Kierkegaard himself has fallen into the hands of a hateful obscurantsdom. Lowry is not wrong to imagine that Kierkegaard, represented by Barth, strengthens the Protestant opposition in Germany. It would not be uncalled for to pose the question to him of whether his own book, to say nothing of Emanuel Hirsch's, could prove itself likewise. Alongside Lowry's book as a corrective to speak as Kierkegaard would, Oxford University Press is publishing a qualitative edition of the journal carefully selected and translated by Alexander Drew through guided primarily by Haecker's 2-volume edition. It is also of significant importance for German readers because it includes a great number of passages Haecker does not. For any familiarity with Kierkegaard, the journals are still invaluable. They're just as far removed from philosophically inflated self-rationalization as they are of fictive sermonizing. They reduce the essential motive of Kierkegaard's thinking to an experiential core, a reduction which proves to be an improvement on the purely psychological alternative. Adorno's letter to Jean Wahl, 4/30/39. Esteemed Herr Professor, the Journal of Philosophy has sent me to your letter. I wish to tell you I am fully conscious of the fact that your stance towards the authoritarian regime is no different from my own. My objection was solely that your book, by strict self-restriction to intellectual historical hermeneutics in the Dalithian sense, does not sufficiently acknowledge the real functional change that Kierkegaard's philosophy has undergone. That the boundary line between Kierkegaard and modern existential philosophy is existential philosophy is drawn so cautiously that anyone who didn't already know better would hardly be able to sense that the pandemonium is being unleashed under the banner of existential philosophy in Germany. As you no doubt did guess, I was thinking primarily of Emanuel Hirsch, who has become a henchman of National Socialism despite representing the orthodox Kierkegaardian tradition. However, I am also of the view that what Jasper has made of Kierkegaard has all too much to do with the more sinister things. As far as critique of Jasper's standpoint is concerned, I would direct your attention to the report on Jasper's Nietzsche book by my friend Horkheimer in the ZFS. Hey, I read that. It's pretty good. Kierkegaard's texts themselves are protected from such misuse to begin with by their relatedness to positive Christian theology. However questionable this relatedness may be, once this theological dimension has been eliminated, it would seem there are no longer any boundaries in existential philosophy to rationalistic individualism and the glorification of blind being so Sheens, maliciously foreclosing all possibility. Further, it seems to me that there is in no context in which it is more necessary, no more possible, to say this than in the connection to the French philosophical tradition. There are many things at stake in this tradition which do not, even in their mycological way of thinking, which I know you adhere to as close as I can afford to dispense with. A straight path runs from the de-godded Kierkegaard to the most pitiful German concept of character. This concept already plays a singular role in the prehistory of existential philosophy for Schopenhauer in present-day Germany. It can only be maintained as a slogan to obey rather than an incitement to think. For me, as one so passionately devoted in the French spirit, it is a moment of great consternation. Even among the most advanced of the French spirits, I have yet to encounter radical counterintelligence in the field of philosophy itself. I do not mean personal political position, which could have come from France alone, and it is this kind of contemplative impartiality towards existentialism which is puzzling to me, because of which I have been compelled to regard you as a representative of a group without wanting to take anything beyond empirical groupings into consideration. It is precisely the extraordinary impression that which your work made on me as a scientific achievement that has given me the determination to express the critical moment with unreserved emphasis. I would only add this, that to me it appears a political analysis of Kierkegaard himself is most pressing, and further, that I consider it a significant shortcoming of my own work, that I do not present the political and social side of this matter concretely. I fear a political physiognomy of Kierkegaard would uncover more features of the new German in him than anyone wishes to find. With most sincere regards to yours, Theodor Adorno. And that is the end of this. I don't know. It's not really a book, though it's as long as one. It's a compilation of. It's a collection of excerpts, letters, etc. Just minor things, all translated by James Crane on the James Crane Substack, which I just stumbled upon one day, just looking up Adorno and Horkheimer things. This is really good. So yeah, I'm going to basically, I think I've learned a bit from adapting the politics of change. So what I'm gonna do this time around is I'm gonna do all one audio file, all in one file, and then I'm going to upload this. The only thing is, I need to, basically, for all the individual uploads, I need to start them with a introduction of my own to the text, where I'm probably going to say, like, what it's about, what I get out of it, etc. So, it would be kind of weird to only do that there and not in the whole video. So, I'm going to write, I mean, you'll hear it at the start, but basically, I'm now going to go back over all this, and with stuff that I noted while reading it and stuff like that. I'm going to write basically an introduction to, I'm going to try and I'm going to end up summarizing each of these essays, or what the point of them is. I might not necessarily repeat the content, but I'm going to do that before each of these sections, and then I will upload that all at once, and then I'm going to cut the audio from each of them, and then I'm going to upload the smaller sections that I think are the most impactful on their own with gameplay footage. Mostly the one on Nietzsche, Spengler, and I think there's one or two more. But yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But thank you for listening. I'm going to do more. I'm working on the Zek project right now, so that's what I'm going to do next. And then I'm going to do, well, I might even, before I finish that, because it's going to be kind of long, I'm also going to do Adorno's lectures on negative dialectics, because I started negative dialectics, and I mean, it's every section is so hard hitting, but also pretty hard to understand. So I'm hoping the lectures are going to help. And yes, I am reading the new translation.